They had no idea who they were dealing with when a flight attendant forced a black CEO family out of first class, what seemed like just another silent act of bias, as it had happened countless times before. But just minutes later, the truth was revealed. This was no ordinary family. The man wasn't just wealthy. He owned the entire airline. And what happened next would not only shake the cabin, but would send shockwaves through the entire aviation industry. At Atlanta International Airport on a bustling Monday morning, the announcement system buzzed continuously amid the hurried footsteps and the steady sound of suitcase wheels rolling on the stone floor. In the sea of rushing passengers, a family of 3 made their way to the priority gate, quietly but strikingly noticeable. Marcus Carter, dressed in a sharp charcoal gray suit, walked with the calm confidence of a man accustomed to power. His wife, Vanessa Carter, wore an ivory blazer, her face graceful yet firm, and their 5-year-old son Elijah held a glowing toy airplane, laughing and running between his parents' steady hands. They didn't need anyone to announce their names. No bodyguards, no sunglasses, no flashy watches or jewelry, yet their elegance, from their gestures to their looks and every step they took, spoke louder than any symbol of wealth. Passengers around them glanced over, some offering polite nods, others squinting in surprise, wondering if they'd seen the man in financial news, but not everyone regarded them with respect. At the rear of the first-class cabin stood Veronica Summers, the lead flight attendant with over 15 years of experience, known for her discipline and her no tolerance for mistakes on her flights. As soon as her gaze landed on the Carters, her face immediately stiffened. Veronica furrowed her brow ever so slightly, enough to remain unnoticed, but in her mind thoughts began to form. Doesn't look like first-class passengers, she thought, her lips pressed tight, her cold eyes tracking Marcus's every move as he stopped at seats 2A, 2B, and 2C, 3 first-class seats in the front left row. Marcus looked around, politely nodding to a middle-aged woman nearby, then turned to his wife. "Here we are. This is our seat." Vanessa nodded slightly, holding Elijah tight, who was eager to sit down, and his eyes lit up looking at the small control panel in front of him. The boy whispered, "Mom, this seat even has a button." Vanessa smiled, gently placing his small backpack in the compartment below, while Marcus stood up to place their 2 bags in the overhead compartment. Everything was done neatly, professionally, as if they had flown first class dozens of times before, and they had. But Veronica didn't see it that way. She stood from a distance, her eyes fixed on them, as though searching for something wrong. Every gesture Marcus made, no matter how polite, was still scrutinized through the lens of bias. A black man with his wife and child, sitting in first class, and with no one accompanying them? She said nothing. She didn't approach to greet them as she had with the 3 white passengers before. She didn't offer the usual hot towels. She just stood there, clipboard in hand, her eyes narrowing slightly, and in her mind she had already passed judgment. No way, they must have sat in the wrong seats. And that's when everything began. Veronica Summers stood frozen for a moment, clutching her clipboard as if analyzing an anomaly. She straightened the collar of her uniform, took a deep breath, then walked decisively towards the Carter family, her steps firm as though she were heading for a security check, not to serve VIP passengers. The polite nod she had given every first-class passenger was now replaced by a smile. Awkward, in a strange way. "Excuse me," she spoke, her voice not loud but carrying an authoritative tone. "I need to verify your tickets." Marcus, fastening Elijah's seatbelt, looked up. Not surprised, he met Veronica's gaze with calm politeness and gently pulled out his wallet from his jacket pocket, taking out 3 pre-printed e-tickets and holding them out to her. "Of course," he replied smoothly. "We are seated in the assigned seats, 2A, 2B, and 2C. Vanessa glanced at Marcus, then at Veronica. She said nothing, but her eyes began to harden. Something was off, something wasn't right, and she felt it deeply. Veronica took the tickets with both hands, as though holding classified documents. Her eyes scanned the details on the paper with an almost absurd suspicion, repeatedly cross-checking names, flight numbers, and seat numbers. All clear and obvious information. But in her mind, nothing was clear if it went against the bias she had carried through 2 decades as a flight attendant. Black people don't sit in first class. If they do, it must be due to a mistake, an unusual favor, or worse, a forgery. She tried to maintain a neutral expression, but couldn't hide the slight furrow of her brows. In an instant, Veronica felt that everything about the Carter family was wrong. From the confident gaze of the man, to the calm demeanor of the woman, even the innocent laughter of the 5-year-old boy. They didn't fit the atmosphere of first class she knew so well. I apologize, but I need to confirm this with ground control, Veronica said, her words like a judgment. Please remain seated. I'll be back shortly. No explanation, no thank you for your cooperation, as she had said to the white passengers before. Just a cold turn of her back and a brisk walk, as if she feared someone would stop her before she could correct the mistake. Marcus watched her walk away, his gaze unchanged, still calm but now a bit colder. He understood what had just happened. It wasn't a procedure check. It was a check on the person. An evaluation based on skin color, more than the information on the ticket. Vanessa gently squeezed Marcus's hand under the table. "What does she think she's doing?" she whispered, her face maintaining composure, but her eyes betraying growing concern. Marcus smiled faintly, his hand resting reassuringly on his wife's. "Let me handle it," he said softly. "This isn't the first time." From behind, a white male passenger in a suit sitting in row 3A glanced toward the front, furrowing his brow. He had just witnessed the incident and sensed the unusual tension, but chose to remain silent, like most people who had seen injustice before and assumed it wasn't their problem. Meanwhile, at the galley behind the partition, Veronica pressed the number for ground control, whispering to herself, "If I'm wrong, I'll apologize. But my instincts never lie. People like them don't sit in first class unless there's something shady going on." She didn't yet know that her instinct, driven by prejudice, was leading her straight to the edge of an irreversible mistake. But that biased intuition was leading her straight to the edge of an irreversible mistake. Inside the galley, the pale white fluorescent lights reflected off Veronica Summers' tense face. She gripped the phone tightly to her ear, her palm sweating, but her voice remained sharp and professional. "I have a family in first class, the Carters. They have full tickets, but I just want to double-check. Are they indeed booked for seats 2A, 2B, and 2C? On the other end was Kevin, a ground service agent. He quickly accessed the booking system, not taking more than 5 seconds to find the record. Carter, Marcus, booked 21 days ago, paid with a Black American Express, confirmed status, no flags. Is there an issue? Veronica hesitated, her eyes darting around as if fearing someone might overhear. No issues, I just need to confirm. She hung up so quickly that she almost cut off the final greeting. A chilling silence enveloped the service area. Veronica stood still for a few seconds, gripping her clipboard as if battling between reason and ego. She had her answer, clear. They were first-class passengers with valid tickets, no mistakes. But the discomfort in her chest didn't disappear. In fact, it grew, not because they were wrong, but because she was, and she couldn't accept that. Veronica was the type of person who believed everything had its order. Every seat on the plane reflected its place in the world. Each first-class seat was a symbol of power, and according to her life experience, whether consciously or not, those symbols weren't meant for black people. They could be athletes, artists, but a CEO in the airline industry? Number. To her, that was off course, and she couldn't stand the thought that she might have misjudged someone. Instead of returning with a professional apology, which a head flight attendant should have done, Veronica adjusted her hair, took a deep breath, straightened her back, and walked out of the service area, her face colder than the fluorescent lights. Marcus Carter was reading a magazine from the seat pocket when he saw her return. Elijah was settled with his child-sized headphones. Vanessa was adjusting Elijah's jacket, but both of them looked up immediately when they saw Veronica's stiff stride. She stopped, eyes avoiding anyone's gaze, gripping the clipboard tightly, and spoke each word clearly. "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry, but there may have been an error in the booking system. To avoid any confusion, I kindly ask your family to temporarily move to the economy class while we verify things once again." No apology. No explanation about the previous confirmation. Just a command wrapped in the polite but cold, surgical tone of authority. Vanessa immediately turned to Marcus, her lips pressed tight. Marcus remained composed, but his gaze slowly shifted from the magazine, locking onto Veronica like a radar. He set the magazine down on the tray table, sat upright, and spoke in a firm tone, not loud but sharp. "So, what's this error you're talking about? Our tickets were verified and valid. Ground control confirmed them. Are you still asking us to leave our seats?" Veronica avoided his gaze. She knew she was stepping deeper into a terrible decision, but like a climber who had slipped, instead of backing off, she continued to cling to the collapsing rock. "I'm just following the protocol, sir. If you cooperate, I'm sure this will be cleared up quickly." A few nearby passengers started to pay attention. A blonde woman leaned toward the person next to her, whispering, "They're being kicked out of first class? Why?" Marcus closed his eyes for a second, as if to restrain himself. He wasn't impulsive. He knew real power lay in calmness. But when he opened his eyes, his voice carried the coldness of steel. "Let's make this clear. You're asking my family to leave first class based on what exactly?" "Valid tickets. Correct names. Correct seats. So what's wrong?" Veronica didn't answer. She had no answer, and she knew that. But the shame of admitting her mistake in front of someone she had underestimated so deeply, that was what made her choose stubbornness. Vanessa gently squeezed Marcus's hand. "We don't need to be here to tolerate this kind of behavior," she said, her voice quiet but clear. Marcus nodded. "I know, but she has no idea who she's dealing with." Marcus stood up. He wasn't in a hurry. Each movement was deliberate and slow, radiating the calmness of a man who lived in a world where every word, every glance carried weight. He turned, facing Veronica completely. His eyes, dark and sharp, were like a finely honed blade cutting through the silence. "On what basis?" he asked again. This time his voice lower, but it resonated in the still air of the first class. Veronica blinked, as if being pushed into a defensive position. The years of experience in the air hadn't prepared her for this moment. A passenger she couldn't easily suppress with a thin smile and hollow professional tone. Her hands began to grow cold. "This is an additional security check, as part of protocol," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "Sometimes the system needs to reconfirm booking information to ensure consistency." "And what did the system tell you?" Marcus pressed, his eyes never leaving her. Veronica glanced around, as though searching for an escape, or at least some implicit support, but the passengers nearby were starting to watch, not with mere curiosity but with a scrutinizing gaze. She felt herself under a microscope, and it made her throat dry. "I think it's best we discuss this in private," Veronica replied, her voice softer, motioning toward the galley. "I don't want to cause misunderstandings with the other passengers." "Then you should have been more careful with your words from the start," Marcus replied, not moving, then turned to Vanessa. "Stay here with Elijah. I'll handle this." Vanessa nodded, her gaze tracking Veronica like a shadow, never leaving her for even a second. She was no longer afraid. Now it was a cold vigilance, from a mother who realized her child was being pulled into a situation no child should have to face. Veronica turned to lead the way, but Marcus was the one truly in control. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if walking through a courtroom of justice without the need for a judge. Meanwhile, the first-class cabin had suddenly become abuzz. Whispers started to spread like ripples across water. A woman with silver hair, wearing a cashmere coat, turned to the person beside her, her voice low but filled with indignation. "They've been so polite. I saw that little boy even greet me when he boarded. Why are they being suspected?" The middle-aged man beside her nodded, his gaze fixed on the galley door. "That flight attendant seems like she's deliberately targeting them. I don't see anything wrong with that family." A young woman who had been working on her laptop paused typing. She gently removed her headphones and turned to the group of passengers across from her. "This is so uncomfortable. No one should be treated this way just because they don't look like someone who should be flying first class." At that moment, Elijah started to feel something was off. The boy, who had been engrossed in playing with his toy airplane, now looked up, sensing the unspoken tension in the air. "Mom?" Elijah tugged at Vanessa's hand, whispering, "Why is that flight attendant being so mean to Dad?" Vanessa turned back, bent down close to her son, gently patting his back. "It's okay, sweetheart," she said softly, but not with a smile. "Some people haven't learned how to respect others. Dad will handle it." Her gaze was no longer gentle. It was the look of a woman who had been through enough to know this wasn't just a small misunderstanding. It was a public performance of prejudice. And more importantly, her son was witnessing it all. A lesson far too early about the world, a lesson she had hoped to delay for much longer. Behind the partition, in the galley, Marcus stood with his arms crossed, facing Veronica. No curious glances here, only the truth and an explanation that had to be given. "I'm giving you a chance," he said, his voice low but sharp as steel. "A chance to tell the truth. Why is my family being asked to leave their seats?" Veronica swallowed hard. Suddenly, the rehearsed answers, the handling incidents training, the customer service protocols, all became useless. I don't think there's anything personal," she stammered. "It's just that we had to reconfirm. Sometimes the system makes mistakes." "You've already confirmed," Marcus interrupted. "The system didn't make a mistake, so whose fault is it?" Veronica fell silent. A silence stretched on, sucking the air out of the small space. She could feel the sweat on the back of her shirt. And for the first time that day she felt scared. Not scared of losing face, but scared of losing the position she had always thought she had the right to decide who deserved to be served the way she deemed fit. "I'm following the protocol," she said, her voice softer, almost a justification. Marcus stared at her for a long time. Finally, he nodded slightly. "Then, I'll follow the protocol, too." He took his phone from his jacket pocket. No rush, no secrecy. He simply pressed a few buttons and put it to his ear. "Now is the right time," he said clearly, then hung up. Just one sentence. But it was like the starting whistle for a storm. A storm Veronica was not prepared for. A few minutes later, when Veronica and Marcus returned to the cabin, the silence in the cabin had been replaced by an atmosphere as tense as a taut string. All eyes were on them, not with mere curiosity, but with a scrutinizing gaze, waiting for an explanation. Vanessa looked up, her eyes meeting Marcus's for just a second, but enough for her to know that something had changed. Marcus gave a slight nod, his hand resting on Elijah's shoulder as he sat down. Veronica turned away, walking faster than usual, but her back was no longer straight. At the end of the cabin, a passenger quietly opened his phone and started taking notes on what he had just witnessed. No one spoke, but everyone knew this wasn't over. It had just begun. The atmosphere in first class remained unusually quiet as Veronica turned to leave after the tense exchange. The passengers were silent, but this silence was no longer indifferent. It was the compression of many eyes, questions, judgments, and frustrations. Behind the partition, in the galley, which was supposed to be just a space for brewing tea and preparing drink trays, now became an unofficial courtroom. And Veronica Summers, once a confident and powerful head flight attendant, now stood facing the man she had looked down on, in a stance no longer as steady as before. Marcus Carter stood with his arms crossed, his eyes never leaving Veronica's face. He didn't shout, didn't slam the table, didn't criticize loudly. But it was his cold calmness that made it impossible for the other person to escape. The pressure didn't come from his words, but from the weight of the truth. "What are you doubting?" Marcus asked, his voice low, but as sharp as a blade drawn from its sheath. "Or is it simply because I don't look like someone who should be sitting in first class?" Veronica froze. Her whole body seemed to be frozen in that moment. That question was not just an interrogation. It struck at the deepest part of her consciousness, where, for years, she had allowed prejudice to grow without admitting it. She had no reason to ask Marcus to leave his seat. There was no error in the system, no abnormal behavior from the passenger. The ticket was perfectly valid. All she had was a feeling that they don't belong here. And now she was forced to face that feeling. Veronica took a breath. I didn't think of it like that," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I just wanted to ensure there was no error in the procedure." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "I run one of the largest investment funds in the Southeast region. I've written security policy guidelines for an international airline. You think I don't understand procedure?" Veronica said nothing. The answer was already embedded in her silence. Marcus took a step forward, not in a threatening manner, but closing the gap between them. Enough for him to lower his voice. "Procedure is not something you use to cover up prejudice. It's not an excuse to choose who gets treated with respect. I've flown first class hundreds of times, but today is the first time I've been asked to reconfirm my seat, when I'm sitting in the right seat with the right ticket, behaving properly. Why today, and why my family?" Veronica swallowed hard. Cold sweat began to bead on her temples. It was too late to retract, and it was too late to blame a misunderstanding. She knew Marcus was not like other passengers. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to record a video or demand to speak to the manager. He understood the system and had the power to change it. "I didn't mean to offend you, Mr. Carter," she whispered. "No need to say it," Marcus replied. "You've already acted like it." Silence fell once again, but this time it wasn't the silence of helplessness. It was the silence of absolute dominance. Suddenly, the soft chime of the intercom system rang. A private signal that flight attendants usually use to call each other. Veronica quickly turned and pressed the contact button. On the other end was Grace, the junior attendant standing at the front cabin. "Veronica." Grace's voice was urgent, but not frantic. "The operations office just called directly to the captain. There's an urgent internal announcement. It concerns a passenger named Marcus Carter. You should come back right away." Veronica's face went pale. Marcus heard every word clearly, but he said nothing. He just looked at her, a gaze that made Veronica feel as if she had stepped onto the wrong stage, playing the wrong role, in the wrong era. She put her hand on her headset, trying to keep her voice steady. I'll be right back. Thank you." Marcus didn't move. He knew the crucial moment was coming. The tide of power had shifted, and now he was at the center of it. When Veronica returned to the first-class cabin, all eyes immediately fixed on her. No one was pretending to ignore her. A young man in glasses took off his headphones. A woman, folding her New York Times, kept her eyes on Veronica. Vanessa saw her husband return and sighed in relief, but she didn't relax. "How is it?" she asked softly. Marcus placed his hand on his wife's shoulder, his gaze calm but as cold as ice. "Nothing to worry about," he said. "But there are many things they'll need to worry about." Elijah whispered, "Are we going home soon, Dad?" Marcus bent down, kissing his son's head lightly. "Not yet, son, but soon everyone will understand what's really going on." At the front of the cabin, the captain stepped out of the cockpit, followed by a senior flight attendant. They didn't speak to Veronica, only whispered to each other before heading back. Grace stopped by and handed Veronica an internal note. The message was clear. "The chairman just contacted us. Passenger Marcus Carter is a major shareholder in Atlantic Skies. Do not take any further uncontrolled actions. All subsequent actions must be reported immediately." Veronica almost lost her composure. Her hand trembled as she folded the paper and shoved it into her uniform pocket. For a moment, the entire first-class cabin sank into a tense silence. Not because they didn't know what was happening, but because they knew very well. And everyone understood. They had just witnessed something far beyond a typical airline incident. A man, polite, composed, and well-mannered, had been suspected, humiliated, and discriminated against, simply because of the color of his skin. But this time, he was not an ordinary passenger. He was someone with enough power to make the entire system listen, and the overthrow had only just begun. As Marcus tucked his phone into his jacket pocket, the atmosphere in the cabin seemed to drop a degree. No one could hear the full details of the call, but they knew he spoke slowly, but with unwavering resolve. Now is the time. Proceed with the plan. Veronica stood a few steps away, completely unaware of what was happening, but her instincts told her one thing. She had just triggered something bigger than herself, bigger than the plane carrying over 200 people. She froze for a few seconds, as if nailed to the floor of the aircraft. Her grip tightened on the clipboard, her knuckles turning white. The feeling of losing control, which she hated most, now consumed her entire body, inside and out. Worse, she had lost the professional mask of someone who had handled hundreds of customer incidents before. Marcus returned to his seat, his face still composed, but his eyes had changed. No longer defensive or passive, they now carried the gaze of a man who knew the balance of power had shifted to his side, and was simply waiting for the right moment to place each piece on the board. Vanessa looked at him. No need to ask anything. A single glance was enough to understand. He had activated his own underground network, a network set up not for revenge, but to ensure that the truth wouldn't be buried under silence and negligence. Elijah sat between them, still clueless, quietly sketching an airplane on the back of a first-class menu. But the boy, like all children, sensed something was changing in the air, and this time it was no game. At the front of the plane, the captain received a Priority 1 urgent signal from the Ground Operations Department. In the sealed cabin, he opened a separate internal channel, and his face immediately became serious after 20 seconds of listening. "Confirm for me," he said. "Marcus Carter, Seat 2A?" "Correct." Full name, Marcus D. Carter, the highest executive shareholder at Atlantic Skies, granted special oversight rights under internal confidentiality terms. A pause. "Has he reported anything yet?" the captain asked. "He just made an urgent call following the sea-level escalation procedure. The legal department is starting an internal investigation. The CEO requires a full report before the plane lands." The captain hung up the phone. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. This was no longer just a customer incident. This was a storm, and it was forming in the peaceful sky above. Below, Veronica struggled to maintain her professional mask as she walked toward the galley. But she didn't realize that each step she took was being watched, not only with eyes, but with the gaze of passengers who had lost faith in her. The white man in Seat 3C whispered to the person next to him, "Who did he just call?" The woman in 1D, who had been typing on her laptop earlier, now closed it. "I guess it was someone important. And I also guess that flight attendant is about to get into big trouble." Veronica entered the galley, her head spinning, her throat dry. She quickly activated the internal phone to contact Grace, but before she could say anything, her phone rang immediately. The screen displayed, "Captain, urgent." She picked up the phone. "Veronica," the captain's voice was no longer his usual detached tone. It was tense. "I just received a notification from operations. We have a very senior shareholder on board, and he just activated the team behavior monitoring protocol. They'll be monitoring everything from here until landing." Veronica nearly choked. I didn't know who he was," she whispered. "That's the issue," the captain replied. "And I advise you not to do anything further. Wait for instructions from above. Any unauthorized actions could result in legal consequences. Understood?" "Understood," Veronica whispered, almost inaudible. When she hung up, she stood still for a moment, her hand instinctively gripping the cold stainless steel of the galley counter. The mask had fallen. Her voice trembled, and now even her legs felt unsteady. Grace, still standing at the end of the cabin, stepped into the galley. Seeing Veronica's bewildered expression, she didn't look surprised. "Who did you just call?" Grace asked quietly, handing Veronica a tray of water. Veronica didn't respond immediately. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the tightness in her chest. "He's the main shareholder," she said, almost as a confession. "And I just kicked his family out of first class." Grace stopped. She set the tray of water down on the table, her face briefly showing deep disappointment. Not because of the incident, but because of the way it could have been avoided if Veronica had just listened. "Veronica," Grace said slowly, "I told you from the start. Their tickets are valid. They didn't do anything wrong, and you acted as if someone didn't deserve to sit in a seat they paid for with their own money." Veronica lowered her head, her face tense. "I just trusted my instincts." Grace stared at her for a long time, then shook her head gently. "No, you trusted your prejudice, and now you're paying the price." In the cabin, Marcus sat back in his seat, opened his phone, and began typing the first lines of text. Not to complain, but to initiate the official process, an executive complaint with attached evidence sent directly to the CEO and the board of directors. Beside him, Vanessa tilted her head and asked quietly, Everything's going as you planned, right?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He simply nodded slightly, his eyes still fixed on the screen. "They have no idea what they're touching," he said, his voice low. "But they'll know soon." Outside, the sky was blue and calm. But inside Atlantic Skies Flight 473, a storm had formed. And it wasn't from the atmosphere. It was from the hearts of the people. In the cockpit, Captain Daniel Rivers had just finished his call with the operations department when the communication signal blinked again. This time, it was Executive Line, Level 1. An internal signal used only when the highest executive team of the airline calls directly to the plane during operations. Daniel frowned and pressed the communication button. The voice on the other end was clear and as hard as steel. "This is Robert Langston, CEO of Atlantic Skies. I require an immediate status report. Is Marcus D. Carter on Flight 473? Daniel straightened up. Though he had piloted thousands of flights over the past 2 decades, this was the first time he had heard the CEO's voice directly in his cockpit. "Confirmed, Mr. Langston. Passenger Marcus Carter is seated in 2A. There was an issue with seat verification, and the cabin crew is handling it." A brief silence, then Robert's voice came through, slow, but heavy like a hammer. "Do not handle anything further. No action, no movement, no communication with Mr. Carter unless directed by me or the executive board. Do you understand?" Daniel nodded, even though the other end couldn't see him. "Understood, sir." "Also," Robert continued, his voice beginning to contain the tightly held fury, "I want the name, position, and full-service history of the flight attendant who asked Mr. Carter to leave his seat. Immediately." Daniel placed the receiver down on the control panel, letting out a long sigh. The word crisis flashed through his mind. There was no more doubt about it. And he knew he wasn't the only one feeling it. At the highest floor of Atlantic Skies headquarters in New York, CEO Robert Langston stood up from his leather chair in the emergency meeting room, throwing the printed report onto the table. His face was tense, his jaw clenched. "Marcus Carter," he repeated. "Not only is he a major shareholder, but he's also the principal backer of our Asia expansion program. He's on his own flight, and he's being thrown off first class." No one in the meeting dared speak. "If this hits the media, we're not just losing passengers," Robert continued, his voice growing firm. "We're losing market trust, losing shareholders, and losing our future." Head of Legal, Martha Klein, stepped forward, holding a printout from the booking system. "Confirmation data, 3 first-class seats booked, paid for with the corporate card from Carter Capital Group. No errors, and no special notes requiring verification." Robert clenched his fist. So, no errors from the system, only human error. He turned to Martha, speaking like giving an order. "I want the name of that flight attendant, full background, previous disciplinary actions, everything." Martha nodded and quickly left the room. Robert turned back to the executive vice president, who was looking at him with hesitation. "Press release ready within 2 hours. But don't release it yet. We still have a chance to control the situation before landing. But if Marcus Carter decides to make this public before then, sorry, no one can save the airline." Back in the air, Veronica sat on the floor in the galley, her head in her hands. The clipboard lay on the floor, papers scattered in a disorganized mess, a stark contrast to the cold, composed figure she usually portrayed. She didn't need anyone to tell her what was happening. Just looking at the captain's demeanor, Grace's eyes, and the continuous calls from the cabin, she knew she had gone too far. And the worst part? This was no longer just a matter between her and a passenger. This was between her and an executive shareholder, someone who had the power to determine the fate of the very senior staff she once thought untouchable. Grace walked over, silently placing a glass of water next to Veronica. She didn't say a word, just sat down across from her, looking at the woman who had once been her superior, now curled up in a state of exhaustion. Veronica choked out, I didn't know who he was." Grace exhaled softly. "And if it were someone else, do you think that would have been allowed?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was simply a truth. And that truth was the one that hurt Veronica the most. In the cabin, Marcus reopened his email. The subject line was brief. To Robert Langston, CEO, Atlantic Skies, CC, Board of Directors. Subject, formal escalation, Flight 473 incident. He typed each word with absolute precision. The language of a CEO not issuing a warning, but an official notification. In it, he requested a full report on the flight attendant's behavior. Submission of cabin footage from the moment his family boarded. A detailed action plan within 48 hours, including overhaul of customer service policies. Mandatory unconscious bias training. A public apology. Once finished, he didn't send it immediately. He handed the phone to Vanessa. "Can you review it for me?" Vanessa quietly took the phone. She knew this email, if sent, wouldn't just strike at the Atlantic Skies system, it would strike every airline still carrying invisible bias. Ahead, the seatbelt light came on. Captain Rivers came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are making altitude adjustments due to turbulence. Please fasten your seatbelts. We will ensure the flight continues comfortably and safely." His voice was calm and steady, but the passengers felt something wasn't in the schedule. A strange, heavy atmosphere hung in the air. In that moment, everything stood still. But at the same time, everything was moving. A system that had operated on silence and assumptions was now being forced to examine itself by a man who had long lived in a world of power, but hadn't forgotten the feeling of being a father. A family sat in the middle of the airplane cabin, not loudly, not angrily, but quietly shaking the very foundation of professional bias. Veronica collapsed into a seat in the galley, the internal computer screen casting a pale white light across her face. A face that had lost control. Her hands still trembled as she typed into the search bar in the internal passenger system. Carter, Marcus D. The system processed the query in seconds, but for Veronica, each second felt like the countdown of a verdict. When the result appeared, she nearly stopped breathing. Marcus D. Carter. Designation primary shareholder tier. Executive override access. Note, board-level access granted. Senior clearance confirmed. Do not reassign seating without corporate authorization. She leaned back in her chair. Her hand dropped the mouse. It hit the edge of the stainless steel desk with a cold clink. Her heartbeat pounded in her chest like a war drum. The words, primary shareholder, blinked on the screen like a damning indictment, not just of her actions, but of the way she had thought, how she looked at people, how she had acted as though she were the law in the skies. She wasn't just wrong. She had just insulted someone with the power to rewrite the rules. In a moment, clouded by fear and shock, Veronica suddenly remembered every gesture of Marcus since the beginning of the flight. His unwavering gaze, the way he responded, polite but not subservient, the calmness when insulted. It wasn't the silence of someone weak. It was the composure of someone who knew the power was already in their hands. They just hadn't needed to use it yet. She began to breathe faster. Not because she feared losing her job, but because, for the first time in her career, she felt herself shrinking within the very world she thought she knew so well. Grace walked in, silently watching Veronica sit frozen in front of the screen. "Did you see it?" Grace asked softly, her voice like mist. Veronica didn't turn around, just nodded. "Oh, God," she whispered, her eyes still locked on the blinking red text. I just kicked him out of first class." Grace crossed her arms, her gaze colder than ever. "No, Veronica, you didn't just kick out a shareholder. You degraded a decent man, a father, a valid customer, simply because he didn't fit the image in your mind of someone worthy of first class. And worse, you did it in front of his young child." The last sentence was like a knife piercing Veronica's soul. She remembered the look in the boy's eyes, innocent, naive, still shaking his toy airplane when asked to leave his seat. A look that didn't understand what was happening, but surely felt that his family was being treated differently. I was just following the procedure," Veronica repeated weakly, as if even she no longer believed her own words. Grace stepped closer. Don't hide behind those words anymore. Procedure doesn't include prejudice. It doesn't give you the right to judge who's worthy based on their skin color or how they're dressed. You didn't know who he was, but you didn't bother to find out because in your mind he was already categorized the moment he boarded the plane. Silence. Veronica lightly touched the mouse, turned off the screen, as if that could make it all disappear. In the front cabin, Marcus remained seated, his phone resting on his lap, the screen turned off. He didn't need to check the email he had sent. He knew the content. He knew the effect it would have. Vanessa sat next to him, her hand still resting gently on Elijah's shoulder, a way of keeping the rhythm of her breath steady after the tense moments. But when she looked at her husband, she saw in his eyes no longer the coldness of before. Instead, it was deep exhaustion, the exhaustion of someone who had grown used to proving their character in every situation, even the seemingly smallest ones. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked softly. Vanessa nodded, but then she whispered, "And you? How many times have you had to do this?" Marcus didn't answer immediately. After a moment, he looked out the window. The midday sun pierced through the thin clouds, reflecting in glimmering patches of light on the plane's wing. Enough times to know the drill, but never enough to get used to it. Meanwhile, in the galley, Veronica still sat motionless. She began to feel the images she once held of herself begin to crumble. The Employee of the Month medals, the customer service training certificates, the thank you letters from the wealthy passengers she had served with a bright smile. All of them now mocked her in this moment. It was no longer a title. It was the mask she had used to legitimize her latent bias, the very bias that had now been exposed to the core. At 30,000 feet, every balance that seemed solid had been disrupted. A flight attendant who once thought she represented professional standards now faced the true reflection of herself. A passenger who was wrongly assumed to be taking someone else's seat turned out to be the one holding the key to the entire operational system. And an airline, proud of its slogan, "Every passenger matters," was now being forced to prove that it wasn't just a slogan. Turning off the system screen did not help Veronica escape reality. The name Marcus Carter, primary shareholder, lingered in her mind like a ringing alarm bell. But instead of admitting her mistake, instead of returning with a genuine apology, what sprang from her heart was a familiar command. Maintain your dignity. Maintain dignity, not for the passengers, but for herself. Keep up the correctness. Keep control. Keep the feeling that she was still the one holding the reins on this flight. And just like every other time in situations where she felt threatened, Veronica chose to retreat into stubbornness rather than move forward with dialogue. She returned to the first-class cabin. Her face was cold, her steps calm but forced. No one stood up to greet her. No one trusted her anymore. The looks that once hesitated because of her uniform had now turned into a wall of silence and judgment. Veronica stopped in front of row 2A, where Marcus, Vanessa, and Elijah were seated. She pursed her lips, straightened her back, and spoke in a steady voice that lacked vitality. "Mr. Carter, we have not completed the verification. To ensure the comfort of other passengers, I need to ask you and your family to move to economy class. Once the verification is complete, we will assist you in returning to your original seats." Not a whisper in the cabin. No pages turning or keyboards tapping. It was all silent, waiting to see the response. Marcus looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting an unreadable glint. Not anger, not provocation. Just a thin smile, cold as ice on the surface of an ocean. He turned to Vanessa, speaking loud enough for her and those around them to hear. "Let's go, honey, but not because we're wrong, but because I want them to pay the price, the right way." Vanessa didn't question him. She stood up, took Elijah's hand firmly, her gaze brushing over Veronica like a slap that needed no sound. Elijah looked up, asking softly, "Where are we going, Mom?" Vanessa leaned down and answered quietly, "We're just moving to another spot, sweetie." But unlike before, this time she couldn't add a smile. The entire cabin watched them leave as if witnessing something that shouldn't be. The silence became a form of tacit complicity, one that everyone was starting to feel uneasy with. A middle-aged woman in row 1C leaned towards her husband, whispering sharply, "This is shameful." The man seated behind her shook his head, eyes still fixed on the three of them silently walking down the aisle. "I've never seen someone so insulted, yet so composed," he muttered. "He knows exactly what he's doing." And indeed, Marcus knew very well. They were shown to their seats in economy class, in the middle of an aisle-side row, where there were no fold-out tables, no private space, and clearly not a place for a small family looking to enjoy a comfortable flight. Veronica pointed to 3 empty seats. "Please, sit here." She didn't turn around after speaking. She didn't wait for a response. She fled from the consequences of her own actions, as if the speed of her footsteps could erase the truth. Marcus sat down, helping Vanessa settle Elijah in his seat. The boy was still dazed, everything happening too quickly for him to fully grasp. But Marcus was not. In his mind, every move had already begun to play out. He opened his phone and typed a few lines of text. Not to send right away, but to complete the internal report he knew he would soon need for the shareholder meeting. Changing cabins was a proactive decision, not out of submission, but to create living proof. Marcus knew that if they stayed and argued, that action would be distorted, taken out of context, and seen as provocation. But if he and his wife quietly walked away, letting everyone else witness how a black family was forced out of the seats they had paid for, then the truth would stand on its own, without a word spoken. Up at the front of the cabin, a rapid conversation was taking place within the internal system between the head flight attendant, the captain, and the ground operations team. Did they move to economy class? Confirmed. Carter's still silent, but taking notes using personal devices continuously. Alert Level 2, prepare for internal media crisis management. Back in the galley, Veronica entered like someone who had just run a marathon. She placed her hands on the stainless steel counter, bent her head down. Around her neck was the name tag lanyard, which now seemed like an invisible noose. Grace didn't say anything. She had seen it all, and she knew that Marcus Carter's silence was more terrifying than any lawsuit. Veronica whispered, "What have I done?" Grace remained silent. She knew that anything said now would not help Veronica, because Veronica needed to face herself first. Meanwhile, on the plane, amidst the hum of the air conditioning and the sound of magazines turning, the three-person family sat closely together, silent, but not defeated. Marcus glanced around. The passengers in economy didn't know the full story, but they saw his gaze, and most of them lowered their heads, uncomfortable. Not out of fear, but because they felt ashamed on their behalf. Vanessa looked at her husband. "Are you okay?" Marcus nodded. More than ever. And he truly was, because what he was waiting for was not instant justice, but an explanation before the public. And now he had given the airline a chance to either admit its mistake or face the consequences. As the Boeing 787 descended, the engine's hum softened, and the screeching sound of the wheels touching down at JFK International Airport echoed like a bell marking the end of the flight, and the beginning of a new battleground on the ground. In the cabin, passengers were rearranging their belongings, packing away laptops, adjusting their ties, preparing for the next leg of their journey. But no one at all, was without a feeling that something remained unresolved. Because everyone knew what they had just witnessed was not a minor incident. It was a system failure, an exposed act of discrimination, a seismic shift beneath the veneer of civility. Captain Rivers switched on the prepare to disembark light, then spoke over the intercom, calmly, but if one listened closely, they could hear the caution in his every breath. "Ladies and gentlemen, Flight 473 has safely landed in New York. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. Thank you for flying with Atlantic Skies. We wish you a pleasant day." He paused for a moment. "And hope we have served you with the respect you deserve." A few passengers looked up, frowning. That closing sentence was unusual. It implied more than a simple farewell. And perhaps the captain understood as well. An apology doesn't always have to be spoken. Sometimes it's enough to be reflected in the eyes and actions. At the gate, two men in dark suits with security compliance name tags, accompanied by a woman in a dark gray airline uniform, the cabin coordination manager, were waiting. Their faces were expressionless, their postures stiff, eyes fixed on the airplane door. No one had to say it, but everyone knew they weren't there to welcome passengers. They were there to take the consequences. The airplane door opened. The passengers filed out, but all eyes subtly glanced toward Veronica, still standing in the back of the cabin like a discarded shadow. Her face was pale, eyes darkened from the stress of the flight. Her hand, holding the clipboard, now seemed like an unnecessary object. A young flight attendant walked over, whispering, "They've asked for you, to stay behind." Veronica nodded. She already knew, and this time she couldn't hide behind any procedure anymore. Marcus Carter stood up, gently patting his son on the shoulder, then helping Vanessa with her bag. He didn't look back, but as he stepped out of the cabin, he gave a subtle nod to the captain, a calm gesture, yet one full of authority. Captain Rivers nodded back, not a gesture of the airline, but of a man who knew he owed an apology. Along the aisle, passengers who had left earlier stood scattered, not rushing to leave. Many paused when they saw the Carter family walking quietly past, but this time they were met with a silence that no longer felt cold, but rather a silent respect. A middle-aged man nodded to Marcus, not saying a word. An older white woman lowered her glasses, softly saying, "I'm sorry for what you had to endure." Marcus didn't stop, but he gave a slight nod. His gaze wasn't forgiveness. It was a message. I acknowledge it, and I will act. At the airport terminal, the phones of the press offices all chimed simultaneously. An email from Carter Capital's legal division had been sent to multiple media inboxes. Press release, urgent, from Legal Representative Office of Marcus D. Carter. We confirm that Mr. Marcus Carter, the executive shareholder, founder of Carter Capital, and senior member of the Strategic Oversight Board at Atlantic Skies, was subjected to improper treatment on Flight 473 today. We officially request a comprehensive internal investigation into discriminatory actions and service violations, a complete overhaul of internal policies, including those related to handling premium. Passengers. Mandatory retraining for all flight attendants, particularly on identifying and eliminating unconscious bias. A public apology from Atlantic Skies Executive Board to the Carter family, along with a commitment to prevent recurrence. We will continue to monitor the rectification process. If no satisfactory response is received within 48 hours, we will initiate legal actions and release detailed evidence to the press. Signed, Clara Mendoza, Senior Attorney, Carter Capital. At Atlantic Skies headquarters, an emergency meeting was held that night. CEO Robert Langston sat at the head of the table, in front of him a printout of the email, along with a media response chart rising by the minute. Hashtags like #FlyFair, #CarterWrites, #SilentPower were starting to appear across Twitter, LinkedIn, and Reddit. If we don't act fast, this will escalate into a nationwide crisis, Martha Klein, the head of legal, said quickly. The media has got wind of it, and this is a man who doesn't back down easily. Robert Langston gripped the pen in his hand tightly. He doesn't need to shout, he doesn't need to record anything. He just needs to walk off the plane in silence and let the system deliver the blow. Everyone in the room understood. Marcus Carter had just proven the most dangerous thing to any unjust system, that justice could come without yelling. Back at the plane's rear, Veronica was stopped by 2 security officers. They weren't aggressive, but firm enough. Ms. Summers, please remain in the cabin. The management office wants to speak with you. She nodded, not resisting. In her mind, every conversation during the flight rewound like a film reel. But this time, there were no edits. Only the rawest truths: prejudice, avoidance, stubbornness, and the steep price of misguided arrogance. The air in the interview room at JFK's administrative area was cold, even though the air conditioning wasn't particularly strong. The room was gray and white, with only a metal table, 2 chairs, and a surveillance camera mounted on the wall. Veronica Summers sat upright, trying to maintain a calm demeanor, but her hands were gripping each other so tightly that her knuckles turned white. On the table was a sealed bottle of water. She hadn't touched it. Across from her sat 3 members of Atlantic Skies' Internal Investigations Department, representing the following divisions: Senior Human Resources, Internal Legal, and Service Quality Management. They didn't need introductions. Veronica knew the process all too well, but today she wasn't the one asking the questions. The woman representing the legal department began the meeting, her voice sharp, with no trace of mercy. Ms. Summers, we request that you explain in full why you asked passenger Marcus Carter and his family to leave first class despite their valid tickets. Veronica opened her mouth, but no sound came out. We have copies of the internal cabin recordings, the booking records, payment confirmations, and information from the crew, the representative continued. So please, answer briefly. Why did you doubt Mr. Carter's ticket? There was no avoiding it now. No more procedure or security excuses. Veronica hesitated for a moment, then stammered, I wasn't sure they fit in first class. The man representing Human Resources leaned forward, his voice deeper, but full of pressure. Based on what exactly? Did they act inappropriately? Dress inappropriately? Failed to present a ticket? Or did you simply feel they didn't look like the kind of person who should sit there? Veronica choked on her words. Her throat felt like it was being squeezed. A rush of heat ran down her spine, but her words spilled out like an unintentional but fatal confession. They didn't look like first-class passengers. The moment those words left her mouth, the atmosphere in the room changed immediately. The woman representing legal stopped writing and looked up at Veronica. Her eyes weren't angry, just the silent stare of someone who had just heard something unforgivable in any professional environment. "Do you realize what you've just admitted?" she asked, her voice light but chilling. Veronica looked down at the table. Her heart raced. Sweat began to seep through the fabric on her back. The man in the middle flipped through the file. "Do you know that Marcus Carter is a founding shareholder, a strategic board member, and was commended for his customer service reform initiatives at the industry-wide conference last year, hosted by Atlantic Skies?" Veronica couldn't respond. "Do you know he was the main architect of the internal conduct ethics framework, the very one you were trained on in 2021? The legal representative continued. Veronica closed the gap between shock and shame with a small nod. She remembered. Very clearly. The service management investigator then slid a stack of papers toward her. "This is the official complaint extract that Mr. Carter submitted to the board of directors. In it, he specifically mentions you. Not for a singular act, but because you represent a systemic issue. Implicit bias." He paused, staring directly into Veronica's eyes. "You didn't just offend a family. You hurt the very credibility that Atlantic Skies has been working to build for 2 decades. Veronica felt as though each question was a brick in the wall of accusations she had quietly built with her prejudice, pride, and illogical professionalism. She had once believed she was fair, serving the right people, following the right procedures. But she had never asked herself what that right standard was based on. And why did the image of a well-dressed, polite black family make her uncomfortable? The meeting lasted almost an hour. No one raised their voices. No one insulted her. But Veronica knew she didn't need anyone to accuse her anymore. She had already done it, with her own words. When the questioning ended, the legal representative said the final words before turning off the recorder. "From now on, you are suspended for internal investigation. The final results will be sent to Human Resources and the Executive Board within 72 hours. During this time, you are not permitted to contact any members of the crew or passengers from Flight 473. Veronica nodded. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply stood up and silently left the room, feeling a terrifying emptiness. Outside in the hallway, she walked past a TV screen broadcasting news from a national media outlet. Atlantic Skies faces racial discrimination allegations from founding shareholder Marcus Carter. The incident occurred on Flight 473 from Atlanta to New York, where the Carter family was asked to leave first class despite having valid tickets. Mr. Carter's attorney demands a full investigation, policy overhaul, and a public apology. Public outcry is growing. Veronica stopped. She stared at the scrolling ticker at the bottom of the screen. Every word that passed by felt like a knife slicing through her. Racial discrimination. Founding shareholder. Reputation crisis. Demands reform. She hadn't been fired yet. But now she knew. The only thing that could save her was not a defense. It was change. From the root. The following morning, before the day's first news had even fully broken, Atlantic Skies Operations Center in New York was buzzing like a beehive that had been struck. At 8:15 a.m., Robert Langston's email inbox, the CEO of the airline, received an urgent email with the subject marked as critical, attached with the familiar digital signature of authority. From Marcus D. Carter to Robert Langston, CEO, Atlantic Skies. CC, Board of Directors, Ethics Oversight Board, Media Relations Office. Subject, immediate action required. Overhaul of service system and internal culture. The incident on Flight 473 is not an isolated occurrence. It is a clear symptom of a systemic disease, implicit bias, lack of oversight, and a culture of irresponsibility. As a primary shareholder and strategic executive advisor of Atlantic Skies, I request the immediate implementation of the following actions. Implement mandatory unconscious bias and diversity culture training for all staff. From ground personnel to the executive board. No exceptions. Establish an anonymous feedback mechanism and independent third-party oversight. System to record, investigate, and address biased, discriminatory, or deviation behavior. Issue a formal, public apology from the CEO, not only to my family but to all. Passengers and employees who have ever felt disregarded, dismissed, or unjustly judged. Commit to providing monthly progress reports on reform to the Shareholder Board and the Ethics Oversight Board for a period of at least 18 months. Let me be clear, this is not a suggestion, this is an expectation. Failure to fully comply will result in an emergency shareholder meeting, calling for a vote of no confidence in the current executive board. Marcus D. Carter, CEO, Carter Capital Group primary shareholder, Atlantic Skies board member, Strategic Oversight Council. Robert Langston read the entire letter without taking his eyes off the screen. Outside, the phone rang non-stop. Messages from reporters, investors, and international partners piled up without end. But the voice in his head at that moment was the closing line. This is not a suggestion. This is an expectation. In the airline's West Office in San Francisco, Martha Klein, the head of legal, was meeting with the crisis response team. She set the phone down after reading Marcus' letter and turned to the advisory team. We need to accept everything. Not a single point can be disputed. But a public apology? A mid-level manager whispered, that would be admitting the fault of the whole system. Martha turned back, her eyes cold as steel. It is the fault of the whole system, and we have no choice. On social media, the domino effect had already begun. Hashtags #Carter vs. Skies, #Silent Power, and #Unconscious Bias Kills. Service flooded Twitter, Reddit, and LinkedIn. Aviation forums, customer service groups, and even shareholder investment forums began lively discussions. This is Atlantic Skies' moral test. No one is safe if behavior like Veronica's is allowed to go unpunished. A founder being kicked off his own flight. If this is let slide, we lose them. Several social movements such as Equal Wings Alliance, Voices in the Sky, and human rights organizations began sending petitions demanding Atlantic Skies. Release the cabin footage from Flight 473. Conduct an independent investigation into the incident. Transparency in handling the internal actions of the flight attendant involved. At Carter Capital Group's headquarters, Marcus sat in his quiet office, hands resting on the desk. In front of him, 3 columns of data: media, shareholder internal updates, and competitor movements. Vanessa entered, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. You're still choosing to remain silent? Marcus smiled faintly, his eyes still fixed on the chart. Silent, but not quiet. They've already heard. They will do the right thing, won't they? She asked. If not, they won't have a chance to fix it. He paused for a moment, then said, They think all they need to do is apologize, but this time, I want the system to change. At 11:30 a.m., Atlantic Skies held an emergency press conference. At the podium, Robert Langston stepped up, his face tense but composed. Behind him was the company logo. Below it, the old slogan, "Every passenger matters." But today, it was replaced by another line, "Every action has consequence." He began reading. "We acknowledge that a serious misconduct occurred within our ranks. Passenger Marcus Carter, a person who is not only a shareholder but a symbol of trust and decency, was not treated appropriately. We apologize, not because we were asked to, but because we know we were wrong. And to correct our mistake, we commit to—" He read the 4 points from Marcus's request, without omission, without alteration. Veronica watched the live stream of the press conference from her private apartment, alone. When the apology was voiced, she closed her eyes. No one mentioned her name publicly anymore, but deep down, she knew exactly why that apology had to be made. The following morning, before the day's first news could even heat up, the Atlantic Skies Operations Center in New York was buzzing like a beehive that had been struck. At 8:15 a.m., Robert Langston's email inbox, the CEO of the airline, received an urgent email with the subject marked as critical, attached with the familiar digital signature of authority. From Marcus D. Carter to Robert Langston, CEO, Atlantic Skies. CC, Board of Directors, Ethics Oversight Board, Media Relations Office. Subject, immediate action required, overhaul of service system and internal culture. The incident on Flight 473 is not an isolated occurrence. It is a clear symptom of a systemic disease. Implicit bias, lack of oversight, and a culture of irresponsibility. As a primary shareholder and strategic executive advisor of Atlantic Skies, I request the immediate implementation of the following actions. Implement mandatory unconscious bias and diversity culture training for all staff. From ground personnel to the executive board. No exceptions. Establish an anonymous feedback mechanism and an independent third-party oversight. System to record, investigate, and address biased, discriminatory, or deviation behavior. Issue a formal public apology from the CEO, not only to my family but to all. Passengers and employees who have ever felt disregarded, dismissed, or unjustly judged. Commit to providing monthly progress reports on reform to the Shareholder Board and the Ethics Oversight Board for a period of at least 18 months. Let me be clear, this is not a suggestion. This is an expectation. Failure to fully comply will result in an emergency shareholder meeting, calling for a vote of no confidence in the current executive board. Marcus D. Carter, CEO, Carter Capital Group primary shareholder, Atlantic Skies board member, Strategic Oversight Council. Robert Langston read the entire letter without taking his eyes off the screen. Outside, the phone rang non-stop. Messages from reporters, investors, and international partners piled up without end. But the voice in his head at that moment was the closing line. This is not a suggestion. This is an expectation. At the company's West office in San Francisco, Martha Klein, head of legal, was in a meeting with the crisis response team. She set the phone down after reading Marcus' letter and turned to the advisory team. We need to accept everything. Not a single point can be disputed. But a public apology? A mid-level manager whispered, that would be admitting the fault of the whole system. Martha turned back, her eyes cold as steel. It is the fault of the whole system, and we have no choice. On social media, the domino effect had already begun. Hashtags #Carter vs. Skies, #Silent Power, and #Unconscious Bias. Kill Service flooded Twitter, Reddit, and LinkedIn. Aviation forums, customer service groups, and even shareholder investment forums began lively discussions. This is Atlantic Sky's moral test. No one is safe if behavior like Veronica's is allowed to go unpunished. A founder being kicked off his own flight. If this is let slide, we lose them. Several social movements such as Equal Wings Alliance, Voices in the Sky, and human rights organizations began sending petitions demanding Atlantic Skies release the cabin footage from Flight 473. Conduct an independent investigation into the incident. Transparency in handling the internal actions of the flight attendant involved. At Carter Capital Group's headquarters, Marcus sat in his quiet office, hands resting on the desk. In front of him, 3 columns of data: media, shareholder internal updates, and competitor movements. Vanessa entered, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. "You're still choosing to remain silent?" Marcus smiled faintly, his eyes still fixed on the chart. Silent, but not quiet. They've already heard. "They will do the right thing, won't they?" she asked. "If not, they won't have a chance to fix it." He paused for a moment, then said, "They think all they need to do is apologize. But this time, I want the system to change." At 4 p.m., Atlantic Skies held a second emergency press conference in 2 consecutive days. This time, alongside CEO Langston were Martha Klein and a new representative from the Ethics Oversight Board, nominated by Marcus Carter himself. At the podium, Robert declared, "We have begun to change. And we will not stop until every passenger, every employee, feels they belong here." A month had passed since the fateful Flight 473. During that time, much had changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but profoundly and irreversibly. At Atlanta International Airport, on a mild autumn morning, the Carter family stepped onto the plane once more. Same flight, same first-class cabin, but this time no one was confused. No one doubted them. Marcus Carter wore a simple suit, holding a small suitcase, his face as calm as ever. Vanessa looked gentle in a dark blue dress, her gaze thoughtful but relaxed. Elijah, now 6, chattered away with his brand-new model airplane, still holding tightly to his mother's hand. They walked across the jet bridge to the cabin like any other passengers, no red carpet, no applause. But it was this very normality that served as the strongest proof that everything had changed. A young flight attendant, bright-faced, with eyes that held no bias, bowed her head as she greeted them, smiling warmly. "Hello, Mr. and Mrs. Carter. Hello, Elijah. Thank you for returning to us." Marcus gave a slight nod. In his eyes there was no pride, no resentment. Just the look of someone who knew that what was meant to be in its rightful place had finally been restored. At the same time, in another corner of the city, Veronica Summers sat in a small classroom at a community training center. Before her, a slide displayed the title, "Unconscious Bias and Structural Discrimination: Recognizing What We Don't Want to See." She was no longer in uniform, no longer wearing a name tag, no longer carrying the powerful gaze she was once accustomed to in the cabin. Instead, she wore a simple jacket, had a personal notebook in front of her, and wore the downcast expression of someone starting over, from the place she once thought was above others. She wasn't forced to learn. There was no court ruling. But after a month of reflection, Veronica knew more than anyone. The worst thing wasn't losing her job. It was realizing she had once contributed to a system that hurt others, without knowing, or worse, without caring. The instructor asked a question that made her sit up straight. What happens when someone in control doesn't see the bias in their actions? Veronica took a deep breath. She didn't raise her hand. But in her mind, the answer was crystal clear. It becomes a weapon. And we become the ones wielding it, thinking we're just doing what's right. After class, she returned to her modest apartment in Queens. On the table was an unsent email from 3 days ago, the recipient's address, marcus.carter@cartercapital.org. She reopened the email, edited a few lines, and then pressed send. Subject: a step toward owning my mistake. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Carter, I do not expect to be forgiven. I only hope I can say what I should have said from the start. I was wrong. Not just for my actions, but because I failed to recognize, or didn't dare recognize, that I had allowed bias to seep into how I served, reacted, and judged others. I apologize, not because I lost my job, but because your son, Elijah, had to witness something no child should ever witness, their parents being treated with disrespect without reason. I don't expect to return to my old job, but I do hope to become someone who never makes the same mistakes again. Never again. Sincerely, Veronica Summers. Marcus read the email in his office at Carter Capital. He didn't respond immediately. He sat still for a few minutes, then marked the email as read without deleting it. He knew. Forgiveness wasn't mandatory. But change started with small things like this. At Atlantic Sky's headquarters, the Unconscious Bias Training Program entered its 3rd week. Nearly 600 employees had completed the initial phase, from flight attendants and technicians to management. An independent feedback system, overseen by a civil organization, was officially up and running. On the internal bulletin board, a quote from Marcus was printed in bold. No company is innocent. Only companies brave enough to correct their wrongs deserve to survive. At JFK Terminal, a new billboard appeared, not to showcase luxury services or high-end amenities, but an image of a black father holding his young son, standing in front of an airplane, with the text below, "Respect is not optional, it's the runway to everything." The advertisement board at JFK Terminal with the phrase, "Respect is not optional," not only made an impression on passengers but quickly became a symbol in media campaigns, appearing in major newspapers, expert analyses, and conferences on equality and customer service. In just 6 weeks, the Carter family's incident went from an isolated event to a powerful catalyst for a sweeping, systematic reform. Other airlines could not remain indifferent. Delta, United, American Airlines. All issued statements committing to review their customer service policies. Some airlines proactively invited independent experts on social behavior and implicit bias to conduct internal training. At a national aviation conference held in Chicago, a representative from the Airline Ethics Alliance declared, "The incident on Flight 473 is not an exception. It is a wake-up call. And Marcus Carter, with his calm demeanor, has forced us, the entire industry, to take a hard look at ourselves." Human rights organizations like the ACLU, Equal Justice Now, and Human Rights in Transit began using Carter's case as a case study for workshops, training materials, and congressional hearings on fair service in transportation. A testimony presented before the U.S. Senate's Committee on Transportation Services read, "If a major shareholder, a strategic operator, a person with as much power as Marcus Carter can be excluded because of their appearance, then how many voiceless individuals have been discarded without anyone knowing?" That question resonated not only in the hearing, but spread to the public, becoming an undeniable truth. At Atlantic Sky's headquarters, Marcus Carter received the first reform report from the Special Oversight Team. The cover was simple, printed with the title, Progress Report, Phase 1, Culture, Policy, Action. Inserted at the front was a short, handwritten letter from CEO Robert Langston, written in blue ink, neatly formatted, "Marcus, I don't know if we can undo the harm that's been done, but I do know that I have learned something more valuable than any executive certificate. Because of you, we've changed, and we will continue to. This is the first report. We're keeping our word." Robert Marcus placed the report down, turning to the right, where his son, Elijah, sat on the floor of the office, eyes glued to a model airplane. The boy didn't notice his father watching, still focused on building a runway out of toy wooden pieces. Marcus sat down next to him, sitting in silence for a while before softly whispering, as if talking to himself, "We're not doing this for us, but for another generation, so they won't have to endure this anymore." Elijah looked up, his wide eyes full of surprise. "What, Dad?" Marcus smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "It's nothing, just I was thinking about the good things you deserve to grow up with." On social media, the hashtag number CARTERSTANDARD began to appear, initiated by a group of passengers demanding airlines publicly share their fairness criteria in service, report racial and gender complaint rates, and commit to ongoing bias training. A LinkedIn post by a former flight attendant read, "I used to think professionalism was enough, but thanks to Carter's story, I now realize professionalism isn't enough if it doesn't include fairness." As for Veronica, she continued to participate in training programs at the Center for Justice and Social Awareness. During a panel hosted by a nonprofit, she stood up, introducing herself as a person who was wrong, but didn't accept staying there. She shared her story, not avoiding or sugarcoating it. No one applauded, but many nodded, not to praise her, but to acknowledge that change begins with the courage to admit fault. At the end of the year, Marcus was invited as an honorary guest at the National Customer Service Conference. In his closing speech, he didn't talk about himself or recount the incident of being kicked out of first class. Instead, he said, "We live in a society where politeness is questioned and prejudice is rationalized by processes. But justice doesn't come with an apology. It comes when we fix what's wrong, not because we're forced to, but because we know we can't continue as we were. I don't want my child to grow up and prove they deserve respect. They just need to be themselves and still be respected." The entire auditorium stood, not for his fame, but for the message, coming from real experience, from steadfastness, and from someone who chose change over revenge. The legacy of Flight 473 ultimately wasn't in the firing of a flight attendant. It was in the fact that thousands of people, staff, passengers, even CEOs, were forced to reflect on themselves, and from that, a system began to change. An industry started rewriting how to serve, not just from the air, but from the heart. If you found this story thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share the video with those who need it, and subscribe to the channel to not miss the next powerful justice stories.